It is always important to observe the times in which we are discussing, not only through a single lens on the one country, but also in perspective with what is happening elsewhere in the world. Feudalism existed on the European continent in various forms, although with much in common. This was, of course, almost completely unknown to the people in Japan, however. The social structure in Japan went through some changes over its long history, but one thing that remained the same was that the emperor remained at the top of the pyramid. The emperor may not have always ruled the country, but was always the spiritual leader. The military class took hold when the Minamoto clan grabbed power in the late 12th century, but the class differentiation was most obvious during the Tokugawa shogunate from the 17th to the 19th century. The samurai class made up the highest rung of feudal society in Japan, even though they accounted for less than 10% of the population. Generally, they were more educated than people in the other classes, but since the economy was based on agriculture, the peasants accounted for the greater portion of the population, around about 80%, and were only one step below the samurai in social importance. This social order was derived from Confucianist principles. In the Chinese scheme of things, society was divided into, in descending order, literati, peasants, artisans, and the merchants. The merchants were the lowest because they were not directly engaged in the production of labour, and they only benefited from other people's hard work. Japan's system replaced the literati with the samurai class. What's more, the Japanese system was actually a lot more rigid. In China, any male, irrespective of how lowly his birth, could aspire to the top rung of the ladder, assuming that he had passed the competitive civil service examinations. In Japan, on the other hand, the only determining factor was the family that you were born into. Under Tokugawa rule, Japan consisted of some 260 fiefdoms, overseen by samurai, and ruled by a feudal lord known as the daimyo. The shogun was the head of the house of Tokugawa, and he was the mightiest daimyo of them all. He dominated the country with his military government, known as the bakufu, from Edo. Now, all feudal lords were required by the law of alternate attendance, in Japanese known as the Sankin Kotai, to maintain official estates in Edo, where they were obligated to reside in alternate years. During their absence from the shogun's capital, Edo, the lords were required to leave their wives and their heirs at the Edo residences as virtual hostages, which was a protective measure done by the bakufu against insurrection in the provinces. The process of social differentiation between the peasants and the samurai was actually accelerated by Toyotomi's katanagari, which is known as the sword hunt of 1588. And this was where weapons were confiscated from the peasants. Toyotomi promised that if all the peasants handed in their weapons, he would melt them down and he would build a great big Buddha out of the blades. Although this was ideologically a very persuasive idea, it was also motivated by a strong desire to bring to an end the numerous and constant peasant rebellions during the Sengoku Era. If you remember correctly, the Sengoku Era was the warring states period. The samurai were forbidden from gaining income from their own means, and this was in keeping with the separation of the classes, and also due to the fact that the samurai actually received stipends similar to the modern day salary. And this was determined by their rank, which they received from the daimyo. This was often paid in what's called a koku. So one koku was enough rice to feed one person for a year. The daimyo therefore had the exclusive right of the taxes and setting his own set of laws in his land. So it was somewhat of an autonomous state. They were not responsible for direct taxation to the bakufu, but they frequently were called upon to contribute to some public works. The daimyo, who were also ranked in hierarchical order, owed allegiance to the shogun, while the shogun owed absolute allegiance to the emperor, from whom his legitimacy was actually derived. And the shogun was also responsible for the economic welfare of the imperial court. The moral code of Bushido was most pronounced during the Tokugawa shogunate, and influenced the social system a great deal. Bushi, meaning warrior, is a term that's existed for longer than the word samurai. In fact, they both have very similar, if not the same meaning.
It can be summed up in many different ways, but basically it's this. The inferior is always loyal to his superior. The superior was expected to show benevolence to his inferior. So loyalty and benevolence, a daimyo-samurai relationship, the wife, the husband, apprentice, master, tenant, landlord. Bushido wasn't actually a commonly used term until the 20th century. It's an unwritten code, even though it had been known for some time, and that's because there never was an agreed upon definition of the term Bushido from each han, or the domain. And they had their own interpretations of the finer points of the definition anyway. Neo-Confucianist scholar Yamaga Soko attempted to write down the essence of the Bushido in the late 17th century, as did other notable scholars such as Yamamoto Tsunetomo and the 20th century scholar Nitobe Inazo. But it really is quite hard to put an ideal into words that everyone agrees upon. I encourage you to investigate that further, but for the sake of brevity, I'll move on. A fantastic author named Romulus Hillsborough wrote that the samurai had a responsibility to right a wrong. To the samurai, revenging a wrong done on one's clan, or the daimyo, or a parent, or anyone superior, was often the sole means of realizing justice in the world. To the samurai, the degree of courage was not measured by one's readiness to draw one's sword, nor was fearlessness or blind bravery qualities of a truly courageous man. Courage, rather, was a quality inseparable from the strength of mind or the fortitude of spirit. Fidelity was an intrinsic element of Bushido, and the essence of which was directed at a two reasons. Directed to the clan and also to the daimyo. While samurai throughout Japan had historically demonstrated with their very lives loyalty to the master or the fellow clansmen, the warriors of the Satsuma clan were perhaps unsurpassed in the purity of the fidelity they embraced. Satsuma was a region in the very south of Japan on the southern island of Kyushu. It's no wonder that the Satsuma produced some of the most stoic warriors in Japan with the readiness to die in the service of their lord. Bushido was not a recognition nor a description of what was really happening, of reality. Rather, it was a wholehearted belief of an ideal. It is what the samurai constantly strived for. So Bushido's views on life and death were largely a product of Buddhism. The moral principles of Bushido were Confucianist, with quite a lot of Shinto as well. There were, of course, plenty of samurai that abused the power in which they held through their mere title alone. And it's extremely interesting to note as well that the moral bond between the daimyo and the samurai weakened around the end of the Tokugawa, or the Edo period, because of the increasingly obvious contradictions between the ideal and the reality of what was happening. And that is that the modern world was encroaching upon Japan.